Hi, I'm Tom Devlin, the editor-in-chief of Drawn Quarterly, and today I'm going to be talking to Ryan Holmberg. Ryan is a historian and a translator for Japanese comics. He recently translated Yoshiharu Tsuge's The Swamp for Drawn Quarterly. Ryan, first thing I'd like to ask is how you came to research and translate Japanese comics.
Hi Tom. Hi everybody. My name is Ryan Holmberg. I am the translator and series co-editor for the new Yoshiharu Tsuge collected mature works from Drawn Quarterly, and today is April 28th. It is the release date of the first volume titled The Swamp. And as you can see here, it's a little bit warmer where I am than where Tom is. I've come to an actual swamp to shoot this in warmer North Carolina. You asked me how I got into translating and researching Japanese comics. I read comics all the way through childhood and my teenage years. I was born in Japan, half grew up in Japan. Father was U.S. military. He was stationed there off and on for a number of years. I've spent, maybe 14 years of my life there between childhood and adult. I studied art history in college and then started a graduate degree in the same, Japanese art history. But between undergrad and graduate school, a Japanese friend of mine, an artist, introduced me to Tsuge Yoshiharu's work, actually, mainly the work from his Garo years. And that really opened my eyes to what manga could be and what manga was, and how different it was from American comics, and also how much more interesting and complicated and impressive it was than proper art, museum art. So I ended up writing my dissertation on the early years of Garo and started a bunch of translation projects related to Garo artists. And now here we are with the Tsuge Yoshiharu series kicking off, which for me is basically like a 20-year-old dream come true.
For those of us who've been following Japanese comics for years, it's always been clear that the comics magazine Garo is kind of ground zero for alternative manga. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the origins of Garo and a little bit about the history, and finally how Tsuge fits into all that and how it influenced him.
So here I am holding a special issue of the magazine Garo from June 1968. It is a special issue dedicated to the work of Tsuge Yoshiharu that the magazine published. This is actually a facsimile edition from 1991 that was produced in the wake of the new Tsuge boom after The Man Without Talent hit big, but it's basically identical to the original version. Garo, you'll see here, note the cover, that is a little boy at a swamp. So the swamp is very much kind of ground zero for Tsuge's imagination when it comes to his Garo years, which the new volume focuses on. So, see, Garo. So Garo was founded in 1964 by an artist named Shirato Sanpei, who has unfortunately not been translated much in English, and we should really do something about that soon. But it's founded in 1964 by Shirato Sanpei. Now, Shirato Sanpei was well known as an author of ninja manga, and he made a lot of money publishing action stories about young ninja boys in mainstream magazines in the early 60s. But prior to that, Shirato Sanpei was involved in something known as the Kashihon market. Kashihon means rental books. He, since the late 1950s, he had published a number of books in the Kashihon market, books that were rented to children who couldn't afford to buy magazines. He wrote ninja stories, samurai stories, and he also drew a number of political items. These two threads came together in a series he wrote from 1959 to 1962. It was called Ninja Bugeicho, the scrolls of the ninja martial arts. The subtitle is The Legend of Kagemaru, and it's usually known by that title. 17-volume series between 59 and 62. It was a huge bestseller, best circulator on the Kashihon market. And not only that, it was beloved by the intelligentsia in Japan. The story is mainly about oppressed peasants in the 16th century and their alliance with warring armed Buddhist monks as they fight against evil samurai. And then there's ninja in the background, particularly a man named Kagemaru, who becomes kind of the behind-the-scenes leader of this peasant rebellion, ultimately a failed revolution. Ninja Bugeicho, Legend of Kagemaru, was much written about by the intelligentsia in Japan in a variety of newspapers and magazines. You could say that comics criticism as a sustained and focused practice basically began around the work of Shirato Sanpei in the early 1960s. So Shirato Sanpei had a lot of cultural capital as well as a lot of money, and he brought those two together by creating a platform, a new magazine, in which he could pursue art and politics as he wanted without the pressures from editors in the bottom line of mainstream publishing. So in 1964, in collaboration with publisher Nagai Katsuichi, who was a main player as a publisher in the Kashihon market, Shirato Sanpei created Garo. Now Garo with a lot of things over different years, but in the early years you can really see how it was connected to the Kashihon market. Shirato Sanpei invited a number of his colleagues or artists that he liked who had been active in the Kashihon market, but as the Kashihon market started to collapse in the mid-1960s, as Japan became more affluent and children no longer wanted to rent their comics, but rather buy them, he gave a home to a number of artists who were struggling to make the transition. Amongst them were Mizuki Shigeru, who would later switch over to Kodansha Publications to become very successful, but initially in 64-65 was struggling. Mizuki Shigeru became one of the main artists of Garo, as did Tsuge Yoshiharu. So what you're seeing basically in this collection is a moment in which Tsuge Yoshiharu and along with a number of other artists are making the transition from the Kashihon market over to the mainstream magazine market. And early Garo represents kind of the bridge between the two.
So it seems that Tsuge is still trying to find his voice. There's samurai yarns, police procedurals, personal drama. This is clearly what was going on in Japanese comics in general, and maybe there's a bit of restlessness in Tsuge's storytelling where he's trying to figure out what to do. Does this seem like a fair assessment to you?
So you said it represents to you what might be a typical mix of manga from the time. I would say what it really reflects is what a struggling Kashihon artist was making at the time. Tatsumi Yoshihiro, who of course D&Q and Gekiga fans will know very well. If you look at his work from the same period, you know, the stuff that D&Q published was mainly from the late 1960s and early 70s. But if you look at his material from the mid-1950s, you will find a kind of a similar all over the place quality to it. Historical things, science fiction, with which Tsuge also wrote, samurai, war pieces, action, thriller pieces, etc. So this is kind of representative of what a lot of artists were doing at the time as they were trying to make the transition from a thriving Kashihon market to a dying Kashihon market, and at the same time trying to branch out over into a mainstream magazine market. And Garo, as I mentioned earlier, provided that bridge for many artists. Other artists like Saito Takao of Gogo 13 or Umezu Kazuo, the famous horror manga artists, were also former Kashihon artists, and they made the leap over to the magazine market much more swiftly and much more successfully. And they were publishing for Kodansha and other major publishers already by the mid or late 1960s. Now, Shirato Sanpei, I mentioned before that he was interested in Japanese history and that he was interested in politics, especially politics of rebellion, politics of the marginalized. This also extended to an interest in marginalized cultures, cultures that were outside of the mainstream of Japanese history, which is usually told around a history of samurai and urban merchants and rice-growing farmers. He was interested in low-level, low-class samurai who didn't have money. He was even more interested in farmers who were tenant farmers who didn't have access, full proprietary control over their lands. He was also interested in different types of cultures of hunters and different folkways that were still alive in different parts of Japan. And you can see this part of Garo, which is usually known for its politics and for its avant-garde art. You can see this side of Garo very clearly in the early issues of Garo, and especially in the work that Tsuge published in the mid-1960s, which will be represented in this volume and in the volume to come, volume 2. Mizuki Shigeru also at this time was doing a lot of stories that were juxtaposing folk knowledge and folk superstition against the onslaught of rapid modernization, industrialization, industrial pollution in Japan, the biggest migration in Japan in its history, intensive depopulation of the countryside and moving into the cities. So all that was reflected in Mizuki's work by these parables that were satirizing these changes and thinking about ways in which older folk knowledge might be revived to combat, even in a humorous way, modernity. Tsuge approached this a little bit differently, as you see in stories like Watermelon Sake or Destiny or The Strange Picture. These are stories all about samurai, but not samurai as we usually think about them as swashbuckling heroes and ruffians, but these are samurai who have no means. They are either cut off from their stipends for a rich lord, or they're no longer a part of their wealthy families, right? This is probably the later Edo period, probably sometime in the 19th century, where samurai in itself was no longer a title of distinction. Subsequently, Tsuge, and you'll see this especially in volume 2, this interested in the marginalized, forgotten, and in the vernacular in Japanese culture, extends into stories about forgotten hot spring towns, different places off the beaten track in Japan. So you can really think about Tsuge as, like many of the Garo artists in this time, is interested in traditional Japan, but not the traditional Japan that you find in guidebooks like Mount Fuji and geisha and sushi, right? It's a vernacular Japan that many people, not just manga artists, but many intellectuals were also worried was about to disappear in Japan. So Garo really worked to try to record that and make a new type of mythology around that. And you see that in a number of the stories in The Swamp.
Of the stories in this volume, The Swamp stands out. There's a sexual undercurrent. There's a psychological aspect to it. It's not quite horror, but there's definitely kind of a creepiness, and a lot is left unsaid. This seems like this is an amazing breakthrough for Tsuge. Did this story have an effect on other storytellers? Did this story have an effect on how he approached making comics from here on out?
So Tom is right. The Swamp really is an important work for the understanding of the history of manga, and especially the history of Gekiga as well as the history of alternative manga in Garo. Just to kind of give you a sense of this, Manga-Shugi, which is the first magazine dedicated to comics criticism in Japan and started in 1967. It dedicates its first issue to Tsuge Yoshiharu, and there's a number of essays in there about the swamp. Also in 1967, Tatsumi Yoshihiro, the man who coined the word gekiga in the mid-1950s, he publishes this manifesto kind of book called Gekiga Daigaku, Gekiga University. And it's mainly text. It's a self-published book from his own publisher. It's mainly text. There's only, I think, 3 manga in it. One's by Tatsumi and one's by Tsuge. And the one by Tsuge is actually The Swamp. And this book, Gekiga University, was basically Tatsumi's attempt to reclaim the word gekiga from what it had come to mean in mainstream publishing. Basically fast-paced but very facile action comics, the kind done by Saito Takao. Go-Go 13 would have been what most people thought of as gekiga in the late 1960s. So Tatsumi wanted to pull gekiga back into what he wanted it to mean. And by including the swamp in Gekiga University, this manifesto, he's basically saying that Tsuge, in his work, especially the swamp, is continuing what he thought was the orthodox tradition of gekiga from the mid-1950s. I'm working on a long essay about the swamp and its reception and its importance and its roots. So I'll just say a few things that might be useful for readers to think about. One, you'll notice that there's not a lot of words. The dialogue, even when it's there, is very short. And one of the important parts of gekiga was that the idea was to tell stories mainly through pictures. It was an attempt to do a more pure form of visual storytelling, and it really forced the reader to look. You have to look at details. You have to look and figure out the meanings, the narrative. You have to look for details that might be meaningful, or you might look for details that might form a metaphorical map of some sort. And you can see Tsuge also really working with that in a work like Swamp, and you'll see this especially in his work from the late 1960s as well. Now it's important to remember that gekiga started basically as mystery manga. There was manga with detectives and criminals going back to the 1920s and 30s. But detective manga wasn't really mysterious back then. It wasn't mysterious mystery manga. There wasn't any suspense. And if you read Tatsumi's writings about what he wanted gekiga to be, a lot of it was about making the reader part of the action, as if they are there in the wind and the storm, as if they are being hunted by the criminal, as if they are hunting the criminal, right? He wanted to make suspenseful suspense comics. So a lot of the visual storytelling and forcing viewers to look at the artwork was to that end. And you can see how Tsuge is basically readapting the codes of mystery gekiga to this end, rather than weapons or evidence that might tell you who the criminal was or who is threatening the protagonist. You find different psychosexual symbols. So what you see with Tsuge in the mid-1960s is basically adapting early 1950s mystery manga for a new literary and adult and psychosexual register. And the other thing readers should think about is you could read The Swamp in relationship to the other Garo stories, especially the early ones that are in the collection. The stories about low-level samurai, especially in relationship to the phony warrior, right? Miyamoto Musashi, the man who poses as Musashi, the great wandering samurai in that manga. You might think of the hunter in The Swamp as a modern version of someone like the wandering samurai, right? Instead of traveling the Japanese countryside in order to improve his swordsmanship, and cleanse his soul. Now the hunter is off in the woods looking for different types of victories and different types of looking for himself in different ways. And indeed, I'll be writing about this in a longer essay I'll be publishing, but in fact there are parts of the swamp that were influenced by a traveling Ronin manga by another Garo artist named Nagashima Shinji. So in this way, Swamp, if you read it, you'll notice it's a very complete work. It's a finished work, it's very polished, but it's also, if you read it in relationship to where Tsuge is going to go in the future volumes, where he's come from in his Kashihon period, and also in relationship to the other works in the volume, you'll see that while it's a completed work, it's also very much a transitional work. Not only in the marking of Gekiga from Kashihon to mainstream magazines, but also in the reinterpretation of Gekiga from pure mystery to something else.
I'm wondering if you know how Tsuge did his work, what his writing process was like, what his drawing process was like, where he worked, that kind of thing. I don't know that I've ever seen anything in the research about him that talks about this.
So, I think I kind of answered this question already in different ways, at least around the swamp and some of the stories that were remade, Kashihon stories. I might defer this question and say to listeners, you should really read the essay that's in the back of the new volume, The Swamp. It's written by a scholar and editor, and also series editor for this D&Q series, Asakawa Mitsuhiro. And he talks about basically how Tsuge developed from being a Kashihon artist to becoming a magazine artist in the pages of Garo. Asakawa is one of the leading researchers of Tsuge Yoshiharu in the world. He has been researching Tsuge's work for many years, and in that essay you will find a number of juxtapositions of pretty hard to find panels from hard to find manga, from manga by Tsuge, by Tatsumi Yoshihiro, by an artist named Matsumoto Masahiko, who was an important colleague of Tatsumi and was really important in the creation of Gekiga and its visual storytelling methods. So you can really see how Tsuge was learning from Tatsumi and Matsumoto in the 1950s, and how his Garo work, at least some of it, comes out of a synthesis of what those artists were doing. Asakawa also talks a lot about the tight community that was Garo in the early days, specifically the artist Tsuge's relationship to Shirato Sanpei and Mizuki Shigeru. So I invite you to read those. In Asakawa's essay, you also see more surprising things, like the fact that Tsuge in his early days was influenced by Chick Young's Blondie, which was very popular in Japan since the American occupation. And of course, Tsuge was heavily influenced by Tezuka Osamu, like pretty much everybody else was in the 1950s. And you'll see that even early Tsuge, when he was still trying to figure out the mechanics of making mystery manga, was swiping from a work by Tezuka, Crime and Punishment, from 1953, which is oftentimes considered a kind of proto-Gekiga work by an artist, Tezuka, who really did not like what Gekiga stood for. Now, this is all go to say that it's important to keep in mind when you're reading The Swamp, even though it marks a transitional moment, that Tsuge at this point already had, 10 years, a full decade of professional cartooning under his belt. So he's a veteran who has to rethink his artwork and remake himself for a new context, the context of magazine publishing. So what you're really seeing is, a veteran kind of finding new ways to do what he had always done, but in new idioms for a wider and different audience. D&Q and I and Asakawa with this series will be moving ahead into the 1960s and the 70s and 80s. But it'd be really worth at some point for someone, whether it's us or someone else, to do a collection of Tsuge's kashihon work from the 1950s and early 60s. And then you'd really be able to see the bridge from the 1950s gekiga, kashihon gekiga, to gekiga as literary manga and mass entertainment and experimental comics. So I will sign off now with that advertisement for a future volume and a prequel, which may or may not ever be published. But in the meantime, I hope readers enjoy The Swamp as the inaugural volume in what promised to be a very interesting, inspiring, and historically important series.
Okay, Ryan, thanks a lot for joining me today. I hope this has been edifying for our viewers, and I'll talk to you later.